Hey folks, my name is Kason, although you may know me as Kalo, and today we're going through the first ever Crucible tier list. Now, before we get into it, I just want to explain how the list or lists work. There's actually going to be two. One is focused on competitive play, which is organized scrims and tournaments and things like that. And then the second one is going to be solo queue. Basically, if you were to queue up right now, or hypothetically when ranked came out. And I'm making this distinction with the two lists because play is very different when you're very organized or in the current state of the game where you can't even talk to your teammates. I'll explain the individual differences a bit more when we're at each of the lists, but first I want to go through how the tier lists actually work. If you've played a competitive game before, you've likely seen a tier list similar to this, but I feel like for the most part when people make tier lists, they kind of just put characters at the certain ranks depending on the power level of the character. But I think there's a lot more room in each of the tiers to really describe what each of the sections says about the characters that are in them. To make this easy, let's start at the top. SS tier characters are characters that are simply overpowered. There's either no reason not to pick these characters, or something about them is just inherently broken, meaning not picking them would put you at a detriment. In an ideal patch, there are no SS tier characters, but on the other hand, SS tier characters existing doesn't necessarily mean that the balance is super off. Right below SS are the S tier characters. These are solid characters that you can pick in any comp and feel good about. They're going to be common picks in competitive play and on the rank ladder. Basically, these are the quote-unquote meta characters. In the middle of the pack, we've got the A tier characters. In ranked, you don't feel bad if somebody picks these characters, but they may not be as common as the S tier ones. And now B tier is where people might get confused, and this is mainly why I'm making this distinction. B tier characters are A tier characters in the sense that their balance, their power levels are essentially the same as A tier characters. However, they have some stipulations. Either you need to build around them, or they're better off as counter picks to certain comps, things like that. It's not that they're weaker than the A tier characters, they just might require a certain situation to meet that power level. And then finally we have the C tier characters. Plainly put, these are the weaker characters. They're either niche or a lot harder to get value out of. Whatever it is, you're going to be better off picking characters that aren't in this tier. Now, before I move on, there are a few other tiers that I considered putting in or might put in later. These include A+, B+, and D. The last one, D, would just go below C and basically would be the opposite of SS, in where there's a character that is so bad for some reason, whether it's like a mechanic or a bug, I don't know. Basically, it would be like the inting tier. And then the main reason for A+ and B+ tiers would be because I suspect that A and B are going to be the largest pools of characters across most patches. And so defining which characters are kind of at the top of A tier and the top of B tier can be useful, but I decided against putting all three of those in simply because we have 10 characters in the game right now. There's really no need to have upwards of 8 tiers. 5 is already plenty, so. Aside from that, we have the unsure or testing tier. This is solely for new characters or characters to get like major balance passes, things like that, where it would simply be irresponsible of me to just put them in a tier before getting more information on how well they can perform. But alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the first list. So this is going to be the competitive tier list. Again, competitive means organized teams, probably in a Discord call. People know how to play their characters, and they're probably doing it in a tournament or scrims or something like that. There are a few main points I want to hit on with this list, mostly, if not obviously, having to do with the top of it. Like, it's the first tier list ever, and he's already claiming that we need to nerf 2 characters. I don't think necessarily that it's the individual characters here, but the problems that they pose. So let's start with the Jonah. I've got a Jonah at the top of the roster for a couple reasons, but the main thing I want to talk about is the Widowmaker problem. For those unaware, basically in Overwatch, there's a threshold where if a Widowmaker player is good enough, she can simply carry a game on her own with little to no counterplay available. She can just get pick after pick, and while that problem is lessened by the bigger TTK here in Crucible, a Jonah can still legitimately eradicate people if she's good enough. The squishier characters die in literally 3 or 4 headshots, and tankier characters get poked out before they can even fight. The quick answer here is to dive a Jonah, which is possible, but then you remember that this is competitive play, and her team is going to back her up. No other character can consistently provide the amount of damage she can, especially at the ranges that she can as well. I won't pretend to have a solution to this issue, but I definitely think that as the competitive scene starts up, we're going to see a lot of complaints about Ajona. In a similar vein, Earl. Oh boy. So I've been testing Heart of the Hive since it was released as a game mode back in like last September-ish, and in every tier list I've ever made about the mode, Earl has been in the SS tier. There are a few reasons for this, mostly around his versatility. He provides a ton of damage, he's got great CC, he's got arguably the best ability in the game, his blowback vents, and on top of all that, he's the tankiest character in the game too. That said, the main point I want to touch on here isn't necessarily about something in Earl's kit, but rather the power level of tanks in the game. If you take a sneak peek all the way down to the B tier, you can see Rahi's at the bottom of the list. Now, B tier, like I said before, isn't a bad character. They're balanced, they just have some stipulations, but what makes Earl so much better than Rahi? Well, a lot of things, whether that's mobility or CC or, any of the things that I mentioned prior. But the main point isn't the difference in that power level, but rather which of these is more correct for a tank character. Let's imagine Rahi is an S tier character instead. His Q works as a blowback vent type thing, he's got some form of long range poke, and he's much tankier than he is right now. Basically, we put him at the power level of Earl, and you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't you take double tank all the time? If these characters can provide as much as any other damage character to the team, and more through their utility, CC, and just outright tankiness, we run into an issue that a lot of games have, which is the tank meta. Crucible does a pretty good job of avoiding this by making tanks self-sufficient. Earl and Rahi, they have great damage, they can hold their own in a fight, but blurring the lines between a tank and a DPS doesn't mean that the differences still aren't there. And when those main differences are basically just, the damage is good for both of these types of characters, but this one type of character is also very, very survivable, why aren't we picking those survivable characters? The power level of Earl feels like a sneak peek to what could become that sort of unhealthy tank meta. And I think we're going to need a solution for that sooner than later, whether that be through new characters that are quote-unquote tank busters. A little caveat that some people think there already are tank busters in the game. For example, Tosca is perceived to do really good against tanks because she can pump a bunch of damage into them over time. Summer for similar reasons with her left mouse button flamethrowers. But if this were the case, I feel like we'd be seeing a lot less Earl picked in draft comps for scrims and things like that. Obviously the public doesn't know about this stuff, but the long story short is we haven't. Earl has always been the Earl-sized presence that he is in the meta. While the Ajona Widowmaker problem is a bit harder to fix, I feel like shooting for tanks to be somewhere in the power level of that A tier rather than the S tiers or the B tiers is probably the best solution. I don't know if that means more damage fall off for Earl or just less overall tankiness for those characters in general, but there has to be some sort of definition created for where tank characters are going to end up in the roster. Otherwise, we're going to see either none of them or all of them. At risk of rambling on that for too long, let's move on to Summer. It's kind of the main other topic that I want to talk about. I put her in the S tier here, the only S tier character, simply because of one thing: her unmatched mobility. Summer, with the pounce perk, gets around the map much faster than any of the other characters. Pair this with her very good farming speed and her still reliable combat stats, and the character is just amazing. I don't think there's a comp that wouldn't want a Summer in it. That isn't to say that she's overpowered, she's in the S tier, she's solid, she's as strong as you would want her to ever be. But I think there's a conversation to be had about mobility in general. In scrims, Summer already kind of screws up rotations for the other team. If you don't have a Summer yourself, you're losing out on map control. That's sort of just how it goes. Sometimes that's a conscious decision that people make when they're making their comp, but it's a lurking elephant in the room that can feel bad, honestly. I've had a couple teams ask to just ban Summer for some scrims, and I can understand why. Imagine a character that's faster than Summer is, or at the least allows their teammates to be faster in some way. Rotations in Heart of the Hives are already, I feel like, on a fine line. Speeding the game up too much would probably break it, but slowing it down anymore would feel bad for casuals. It's a hard conversation to begin to nail into, but I think it's one that we need to have eventually. Moving on to the A tier characters really quick. These are all great characters that can fit into comps responsibly. I say responsibly because there are some cases where it's a little weird. I mentioned an example of this in my Mastering Crucible Part 3. Having Tosca, Sazan, and Rahi on your team means you're really slow and your farming in the early game is really bad. Common mistakes I see teams make are not having enough range damage, meaning they always lose the poke wars before hives happen. And I think there's something to be said about having tank characters on your team in some capacity. Obviously, Earl is, Earl, and so we're kind of used to having him in the meta. I like to imagine a place where he isn't needed and a tank in general isn't necessarily needed on your team, but that's not where we're at right now, so make nicely rounded comps is the main point there. And then quickly, before we move on to the solo queue tier list, I just want to touch on the B tier characters. In comp, B tier characters are going to be more of like counter picks. For example, Bug does really well into characters like Drakal and Summer. However, if the other team is doing more of a shooter comp like AJ, Earl, Shakiri, and Mendoza, Bug is going to have a much harder time, so you don't want to pick him too early in a hypothetical draft. Rahi is in a similar vein where he is really good at protecting your carries. However, if people aren't really diving on him or there's a lot of characters on the other team, specifically Drakal and Tosca, that do really well against him, then it's usually better to avoid picking Rahi. Again, these are not weaker characters, they just have some stipulations to them. Okay, now finally, we're moving on to the solo queue tier list. So there are a few changes from the comp tier list that I think you'll notice immediately. First non-change is that Ajona is still at the top of the roster. I debated putting her in the S tier instead, simply because of this argument that I'm going to make for her as well. Even with the voice comms and stuff not being in right now, let's just say ranks out and voices in and whatever, solo queue is still solo queue, okay? The game is less organized than it is going to be at a scrim competitive tournament level, obviously, right? And what that means for Ajona is that there are less people coming at her at once. Now, it also means that people that are coming at her have an easier time as well, because she has less backup from her teammates, but a good Ajona isn't going to be phased by just one Drakal coming at her. She can usually position well enough to avoid one person trying to dive her, or, in Tosca's case, for example, even just kill the target before they can become an active threat up close on her. And then the other SS tier character is Tosca. Man, I don't really know how to solve the Tosca issue. She is such a pub stomper. She's great at catching people out. She can bully people in the early game. She scales into the late game. A Tosca can run wild in an uncoordinated lobby and just carry the team. Of course, you have to be a good Tosca. You can't just pick Tosca and expect to do amazingly. The character does have a skill floor, although I wouldn't say it's the highest in the game, and as you get higher in these hypothetical ranks, people are gonna know how to play against you better. But again, this is solo queue. If you're a good Tosca, you will likely run over the other team. That's just how it is. How do you solve this issue where she's overbearing in solo play, but is a solid, balanced character in competitive? Is that an issue at all? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I guess it's something we'll have to keep tabs on at the least over time as rank comes out eventually. I do recognize, though, that Tosca is the character people fear in solo queue. And for logical reasons, it makes sense. Moving on to S tier, though, Summer stays where she is. She's super mobile, can control the whole map by herself, and she's got kill potential. Similar to Tosca, honestly, so just a really great character. Not as overbearing. You have to be close. You have to take more risks than you do on Tosca, I would say. And obviously you're not as small or slippery, so Summer's skill floor is definitely higher, and the rewards require more consistent play, is I guess how I'll put that. Drakal, on the other hand, really great at getting picks, and can act as a sort of makeshift tank for your team, in the sense that you're going to survive long enough when you go in, do a ton of damage, and your team can just follow up on that. There's not a lot of coordination required, honestly. The other two main ones I want to talk about are, firstly, Earl. Earl goes towards the bottom of A tier. He's still a solid pick, does really well as the game goes on, especially after he hits level 5 and has his redline perk. You can just shred through people. But before then, he kind of just holds up as a Mendo Light of sorts. He's a rifle, but you're not really tanking for people, at least in as much of a coordinated way as you are in competitive play. And so you're sort of just a bigger target with a gun that takes a while to wind up, Again, he's still a fine pick, but definitely way, way stronger when your team knows how to back you up. And then the other character I want to talk about here is Bug. Bug moves up from the B tier to the top of A tier. I actually considered making Bug S tier, and I think as time goes on, It's going to depend on what characters become meta and what they do with the map, etc., etc. But Bug is a solid character. Bug sneakily has the most support power in the game, has a ton of damage if played right, can be very slippery. Bug really just provides everything you want in a solo queue character for the small price of a very, very massive skill floor. You can tell if a Bug is used to playing Harvester Command, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but there's another level of Bug that I think few have really tapped into. I've talked about it in my other videos, and I've shown some gameplay of what Bug can be at a higher level of play. But to think that that's going to be the common thing, especially now when the game is still very new, is just not realistic. So Bug in the A tier, solid character, but still not overbearing. And that's pretty much going to be it. Some final thoughts. I hope they change Rahi sooner than later. I think that the character could be more fun to play if he didn't have to hold space every few seconds to jump around. Even just like reworking that mechanic a little bit would be nice. Aside from that, I think the most prevalent issues that the devs are going to have to figure out are the Ajona Widowmaker problem and just the direction for the power level of tanks. In the near distant future, I think is a better time to talk about mobility. Once they put in map changes, even a mini map that increases the awareness of everybody in the lobby, I don't know, mobility maybe isn't as valuable later down the line, but until then, it's definitely very powerful right now. Okay, and that about wraps it up. If you guys have any comments or feedback on this style of video, please let me know. If you'd prefer it was just one tier list so it's less confusing, or if I should split the tier lists up into 2 videos. These are things that I've considered doing, but I figured I would just get this first one out there, get you guys' thoughts on the balance and on the format, and then go from there. I've pretty much finished my secrets about every hunter video, but I've been seeing some talk about balance, so I wanted to get this video up first. If you liked the video or learned something, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already and you want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe and hit the bell. I've also got a link to my Discord where I'm available to talk about Crucible pretty much 24/7 in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay beautiful, and I'll see you later. Peace.